I don't usually do this, but I think I should let you guys know that the very end, like the very last section, is going to include potentially major spoilers for unreleased volumes of the book series The Pale Princess and the Six Pygmies. And before you skip to the end because you got curious and want to see what those spoilers are, what I say there is not gonna make sense unless you go through the whole thing. If you're someone who does not want to know the data mined version of the story, then you can stop after the third section. The main lore theory ends there. So when you reach the part titled Divine Serpents, that's where you skip or stop. Cool, now let's begin. The Abyss. A mighty, inescapable force threatening the very foundations of the world upon which the continent of Teyvat exists. Let's be honest, this is a concept that we have seen countless times across hundreds of stories. It's extremely common to have some sort of cosmic darkness or void which understands existence to be a mistake and thus seeks to dismantle the very fabric of life to eradicate all noise and light. The Abyss is exactly that kind of antagonistic force, except it isn't. The aforementioned description is in line with ultimate nihilism, a complete rejection of all purpose and meaning, but the Abyss in Genshin isn't nihility. It is capable of understanding memories, possessing desires, and most importantly, has a logic of its own, which actually makes it a lot more like the Abyss of the Dark Souls series. We know all this thanks to Natlan, since the nation's struggle isn't with the Abyss Order. Instead, its people are fighting the Abyss itself. Although I am putting the cart before the Sumpter Beast right now, so let me not get too ahead of myself. This is a really big deal when it comes to the game's world building, so in this video I am going to tell you what that logic is by explaining where it originates from and what implications it will have on Genshin Impact's story moving forward. However, given how many pieces there are to this puzzle, I've divided the explanation into 3 segments that not only simplify the process, but also build upon one another towards the conclusion we desire, which of course is the nature of the Abyss. To understand why the Abyss seeks to invade and consume Teyvat, the first step is understanding the fascinating mechanisms the developers utilized to form Genshin's world, which obviously involves concepts from Gnosticism, but it is not as clear-cut as it seems. This isn't the Gnosticism you might be thinking about. All the way back during the 3-realm gateway offering, we learned that the world of Genshin is composed of 3 major domains. There is the Void Realm, also known as the Abyssal Realm, the Light Realm, also known as the Elemental Realm, and the Physical Realm, or the Human Realm, which was allegedly fashioned by the Primordial One out of fragments of the Light Realm after conquering it from the ancient dragons. Each of the 3 realms had their own concepts for energy networks that flow in them. The Void Realm has its dark currents, the Light Realm has the elemental currents, and the Physical Realm has the spirit veins or ley lines, the heart of which is the great tree Irminsul. So picture this. In the beginning, there were 2 primordial realms, one abyssal, one elemental, that existed for an unspecified amount of time. Then, for reasons I will progressively reveal later in the video, an egg pops up. And it's a cosmic egg. Inside that egg was the primordial one, who may have been Phanes, and if it is Phanes, then that cosmic egg is also an abyssal egg. We know this because if you check the Orphic sect of Greek mythology, which is where the name Phanes comes from, it is stated there that Phanes emerged from the abyss as he hatched from the cosmic egg. But hey, wait! Phanes has wings and a crown, like an angel. So now we're gonna rebrand the egg to an angel's egg, I suppose. However, we don't really care about that at the moment. Anyway, the Primordial One either defeated or betrayed the ancient dragons, arresting their authorities and gaining dominion over the Light Realm, out of which it crafted the Human Realm. Now, Phanes comes from Orphic mythology, which falls under the category of the wider Greek mythology, yet despite that, Orphic cosmology has been historically rejected as being Greek due to its dualistic nature. I am telling you this because it's crucial for Phanes' identity, both in Greek mythology and in Genshin Impact, since the game's cosmology is primarily a mixture of Greek, Chinese, and Gnostic concepts. Gnosticism was a highly dualistic religion, making clear divisions between good and evil, light and dark. So it's unsurprising that they were the ones who introduced the idea of the Demiurge as an evil false god, the creator of the material world, the physical realm. But that's not what the original intended purpose of this character of the Demiurge was. Let's loop back to Greece, specifically during the mid-4th century BCE in ancient Athens. There, we will find a good old philosopher known as Plato, who was dealing with a big conundrum. According to the principle of sufficient reason, the world exists. So there must be a reason for it. What's the reason? Well, the gods made it. But hold on though, the world is clearly imperfect and people suffer. So could that mean that the gods are imperfect? Nah, no way that's the case. No way, what do you mean the gods are imperfect? Hey, Athenian government, why are y'all looking at me like that? Come on guys, no way you thought I was being for real, right? Hey, come on, you know guys, you know me, I've always been a comedian at heart. I am, therefore I think, you know me. As you can see, there is no way that the gods are imperfect. That would be ridiculous. Still, there has to be a way to explain the imperfections of reality and the suffering in it. Thus, Plato develops the theory of forms, which was inherently dualistic, but Plato himself was not a dualist. That's a major misconception. In that theory, Plato argues for the existence of two worlds. One he calls the world of forms, an unchanging, immaterial world encompassing the eternality and ideas of all things. The other is the world of matter that we perceive with our senses, changeable, imperfect, and transient. This is when Plato creates this character of a craftsman deity. He doesn't say who that deity is, and I'm gonna tell you why in a bit. At that point, we don't really know where it came from, but we know that it's there. And Plato calls this deity a demiurgos, or demiurge, which simply means public worker, a craftsman in Greek. Unlike the Gnostic iterations, Plato's demiurge isn't evil. Once again, Plato was not a dualist, that's important. It's a well-intentioned deity, but it isn't perfect like the gods of Athens, for example. Unlike a creator deity who brings something into existence from nothing, the demiurge is a cosmic artisan who works with pre-existing chaotic matter, so it looks at the world of forms and sees the true reality. The demiurge then takes these forms, like a sphere or a cube, and impresses them upon the world of matter, imposing mathematical and rational order onto chaos, thereby structuring it according to the eternal forms or ideas. However, because matter is inherently imperfect, the forms are imperfectly impressed upon matter. And to kinda elaborate on this, imagine you're trying to draw a square on paper or clay. No matter how precise you are or how much you polish your square, that square will never be as perfectly square as the abstract Euclidean concept of a square that you understand in your mind. That's essentially the problem that Plato's demiurge runs into, where through reason it crafts a world mirroring the perfection of the forms, but due to matter's inherent imperfection it can never achieve the true unchanging nature of these forms. So the world that the demiurge crafts is an optimal one, but it's not perfect. It's the best world that the demiurge could have made given the materials it had to work with, meaning that it's not a quote-unquote bad world. We see almost the reverse of this during Act 2 of the Natlan Archon quest, when Vichama fashions a net on Teyvat to create the concept of a net in the Night Kingdom, with which he can fish out Kachina's ancient name and inscribe it onto an obsidian feather. Mualani and Mahuika explain to the traveler that the Night Kingdom is a very similar place to the ley lines, even housing the memories of the land, since by invading the Night Kingdom, the Abyss could read the memories of Natlan. And what are memories other than ideas in the Platonic sense? Keep in mind, this was a very dangerous theory that Plato developed at the time, because not too long ago, Plato's teacher, Socrates, had just been executed by the Athenian state on charges of impiety and corrupting the youth, because he dared question the gods of the state and the way of the government. This meant that Plato's ideas had to be considerably Greek-centered, including his craftsmen, far, far from the Gnostic demiurge that we know today. In Genshin, it's clear that Phanes, or the Primordial One, fulfills the role of the demiurge, making it the god of the physical realm. We also know that the Dragon King Nibelung was the god of the Light Realm, so if the Light Realm and the physical realm have Nibelung and Phanes, it wouldn't be surprising if the Void Realm parallels the other two with a primordial god of its own, and that's precisely what I am about to discuss. Before we get too deep into the weeds, we must make an important delineation between the Abyss Order and the Abyss. Unlike the Void Realm, the Abyss Order is essentially a terrorist organization, at least from the perspective of Celestia, founded by the Conrian noble Clothar Albric after being influenced by Vedrfolnir. The two factions more or less align with one another, however, that does not mean they stand on equal footing. The Abyss is a way more formidable force than the Order named after it. If anything, the Abyss Order's activities are more akin to a tumor on Teyvat, an extension of the long arm of the Abyss. This is the same Abyss that invaded and corrupted the Night Kingdom, and it is the same Abyss that Mahoika is attempting to ward off with the heroes of Natlan. Interestingly, we learn from Walani, along with our general experience on Teyvat, that the Abyss is capable of understanding its enemies and formulating strategic plans to trick and conquer them, such as when it took Kachina's soul hostage, ultimately forcing Mahoika to exhaust one of her backup resources to rescue her companions from the Night Kingdom. Additionally, through reading the memories of the land, the Abyss can manifest its power in the image of the land's creatures. All of this strongly suggests that the Abyss isn't some kind of unga bunga me devour me destroy type of enemy. Rather, it displays the capacity for intelligent, rational thought and design. And when I say the Abyss in this context, I am not talking about the Void Realm as a whole. Like, I don't mean that the Void Realm in its entirety is plotting to destroy Teyvat. When I say Abyss, I am referring to the entity that rules and governs it. Or, in more direct, perhaps cooler terms, the primordial god of the Abyss. Don't get too excited though. It's super unlikely that we're gonna be seeing, let alone fighting, the Abyss god by the end of Natlan. Ironically, we're still way too early for that. Still, the point of this lore theory is that such a primordial deity exists. During the Archon quest bedtime story, the traveler learns from Dainsleif about the 5 evil sinners of Khaenri'ah, 5 out of 6 individuals of great renown, who were destined to be their nation's heroes and prevent the Vynster King from rocking the foundations of the world. This mysterious Vynster King figure is kinda cringe. First of all, because he's not mysterious to begin with, since if you play in Chinese you get a pretty good descriptor of who he is, while in English, they make us jump through leaps and bounds just to figure out his simple identity. To keep it sweet and simple, the word Vynster comes from the Old High German Finsta, which makes sense since Germany and Scandinavia inspired Khaenri'ah. Finster means dark or gloomy, so Vynster King means Dark King in English, which is still quite misleading if you ask me. On its own, Dark King doesn't really tell us anything, until you realize that in Chinese it is Black King, and Black King is written as He Wang, which refers specifically to the Black King in chess. Aside from Amun, the only other major character so far whom we see playing the game of chess is Piero, who once was a royal mage for the Khaenri'ah Eclipse dynasty during an era where the king he served sought to tear down the Veil of Sin. In Chinese, the Eclipse dynasty is known as the Black Sun dynasty. Thus, the Black King, who Dainsleif says rocked the foundations of the world, can only be the Black Sun King, Ermin. The 6 heroes of Khaenri'ah, those being Vedrfolnir, Hruptatir, Reindotter, Rerir, Surtalogi, and Dainsleif himself, were supposed to stop the Vynster King, but Ermin somehow managed to seduce the first 5 who were unable to resist the allure of the Abyss and ended up siding with the Eclipse King, becoming the 5 sinners. The description of the deathly statuettes, which presumably depict the visage of Ermin himself, but take that with a grain of salt, read as follows. As you gaze upon this idol, you can almost hear a strange, comforting whisper. See, my child, all that lies under the throne of heaven shall be destroyed by upheaval. The eternal peace of the pitch-dark void shall embrace us all. It's abundantly clear that the one speaking here is directly opposed to Celestia, promising that the pitch-dark void shall devour and silence everything. A couple of minutes ago, I mentioned that the Vynster King roughly means dark or gloomy in Old High Germanic, and sure enough, the 2 lower-tier versions of this item are called dark and gloomy statuettes, respectively. This strongly indicates that the figure depicted is indeed Ermin, assuming he is the Vynster or Black King. However, I honestly still have my doubts that Ermin is the one speaking the quote in the Deathly Statuette. Given the context of the type of enemies who drop this item, those being corrupted Black Knights or Abyss-worshipping fanatics, the tone of what's being said suddenly becomes quite malevolent and manipulative. Also, notice the use of the term pitch black void as a translation of the Chinese ever quiet black sky. A deliberate invocation of the Void Realm, if you ask me. In fact, it's the only instance that I can think of in the game outside of the 3-realm gateway offering where the Abyss is referenced by its appropriate name, the Void Realm. Additionally, reading the description of the gloomy statuettes reveals that those who carried these items cherished them like holy objects, a behavior certainly unlike what you would expect from the Conrians. For a people who did not acknowledge the gods of Teyvat, it makes no sense for them to worship their king. You see, I do believe that the statuettes are depicting Ermin, but I don't think that King Ermin is Ermin anymore. The first thing that immediately stood out to me about the 5 evil sinners when Dainsleif introduced them was how their very concept strongly parallels the God Hand from the legendary manga series Berserk, which notably inspired the Dark Souls series and its immediate derivatives. In Berserk, the image of the eclipse, or the Black Sun, is heavily associated with a group of exceptionally evil individuals known as the God Hand. Each of the God Hand's 5 fingers is represented by a demon sovereign who together act as executors of their god's will by virtue of their desires being intrinsic to those of their master. As for their master, it is known as the idea of evil, a primal entity residing in the abyss, which in Berserk is defined as an endless swirl of consciousness that feels as if all the evil in the world were gathered in it, while the idea of evil itself states that the abyss is the manifestation of humanity's collective unconscious and is filled with all their dark and negative feelings. I am sure that most of you can already see the striking resemblances between Berserk's Abyss and that of Genshin, and these similarities will only grow clearer in a few minutes. On top of that, add in Conria's 5 evil sinners as representatives of the God Hand and you suddenly have a very peculiar situation. I truly wonder if King Ermin, in his pursuit of absolute power, was corrupted by or became a vessel of the Abyss God. Okay, we went over how the world of Genshin could have been crafted from the perspective of Plato's theory of forms by his craftsman, the Demiurge, and then we transitioned to the counterpart of that world, the Abyss and its potential god. Now it's time we talk about what these primordial deities are and where they come from. Over the course of thousands of years, mankind grew from weak, disjointed groups of hunter-gatherers into becoming the undisputed dominant species on Earth. Over countless eras of civilization, the most ambitious of humanity learned to till the land, build structures and create inventions that our ancestors could have never dreamed of. Yet, no matter what age or nation, one question that has reverberated across all of human history, puzzling the simplest and greatest of minds alike, was: who came first? The chicken or the egg? The egg. It's the egg. The egg came first. Ultimately, this question is more about the nature of causality and the origins of species than it is about a specific event in time. But from a strictly biological perspective, a bird species evolved over time into what we now know as a chicken, so the egg of the precursor species must have come first. The point of me bringing this up is because Thanes, like I mentioned at the start of this video, hatched from a cosmic egg, both in Genshin Impact and in Greek mythology, but that egg must have come from somewhere, and if Thanes is the symbolic first chicken, the progenitor of all other chickens, then the one who laid the cosmic egg couldn't have been a chicken. Yeah, where did it come from? Well, according to the Council of I Made It the Fuck Up, chickens evolved from dinosaurs, and that's not actually what happened, but for the sake of the joke we're gonna pretend it did. In reality, saying that chickens evolved from dinosaurs is like saying humans evolved from monkeys. They're both straight up incorrect. But alas, I am no evolutionary biologist, so I'm not even going to attempt to explain the appropriate mechanism. What I am, though, is a professional video game yapper, and now is the time for me to put my skills to the test. One of the coolest new additions that we got to the lore from Natlan was the Night Kingdom, which is a place of similar composition to the ley lines according to Mahoika. The Night Kingdom is also the realm of the Wyob, and look, I'm gonna be honest with you, the Wyob are either Seelies themselves, or they are directly related to Seelies. Given that on Teyvat, Natlan is the only nation without deep-rooted ley lines and has the Night Kingdom in their stead, while all other nations so far have ley lines yet lack Night Kingdoms of their own, it's pretty apparent that there is a direct correlation between the presence of a Night Kingdom or a ley line network and the lack of the other. I think I know what that correlation is, and it has to do with Plato's theory of forms discussed earlier. The Dragon King Nibelung ruled as the primeval god of the light realm, but according to Beelzebul and also common sense, whenever light shines, it casts a shadow. She was that shadow. She was the moon to her sister Baal, who was the sun. Well, what do we have here? In the video I made about Rerir and the Ring of the Nibelung, I argued that the eclipse in the ancient world originally belonged to Nibelung, and at the end I said that the video was a setup for many more to come, including the one you're watching right here and right now. You see, let us assume that the 7 sovereigns, being rulers of the Light Realm, were sun dragons. And by the way, this is not a baseless assumption, we do have strong evidence for it, since Neuvillette, although he controls both Numa and Usia with his authority, has Numa as his baseline alignment. Thus, since the 7 sovereigns were the sun dragons of the Light Realm, then the Moon Sisters must have been the shadow that they cast, the 3 queens of the Land of Night. You see, in Volume 3 of the Moonlit Bamboo Forest, the beautiful Seelie whom the young boy meets tells him that the 3 luminous moons shared but one love, the stars of daybreak. Only at the fleeting moments when day and night converged could one of the 3 sisters pass the fading stars and gaze upon the chambers of the morning stars. Ever since Genshin's release, this paragraph always had me confused, since the morning star should either refer to Venus, which was historically thought to be a star, or the sun, both of which are singular. Yet the Moonlit Bamboo Forest says stars of daybreak in plural. But now it makes sense if we are to say that these morning stars that the 3 Moon Sisters loved were the 7 dragon sovereigns of the Light Realm. Over a year ago, I made a video where I claimed that the Seelies in the ancient past were a special group of lunar dragons that served the Dragon King Nibelung. And while I stuck with this general idea for the longest time, Natlan's release allowed me to refine this concept into something much better. Take a look at Byakuya-Koku. It's an ancient land dating back to the first civilization of the Primordial One. After Celestia's war with the Second Descender, Byakuya-Koku sunk beneath the earth, and the survivors, led by the sage Abrax, built an artificial sun known as the Hyperion. The Hyperion can be manually toggled on and off to control Enkanomiya's day and night cycles, called White Night and Evernight. Depending on which state the Hyperion is in, you can see different parts of Enkanomiya, almost as if the entire land is composed of 2 versions that exist together simultaneously. Although the Night Kingdom can be found underneath Natlan, this placement is most likely a design trick to hide the area rather than a true topographic representation of where the Night Kingdom is located. But in that case, where is the Night Kingdom? The answer is all around us. Natlan is the Night Kingdom. Both are 2 sides of the same coin. 2 worlds forever intertwined, yet never the same. And here's the catch. At some point in history, I believe that this was the case across all of Teyvat. In Volume 3 of the Records of Hanan Pacha, Waxaklahun Ubah Kan, that's the ancient dragon who gave humanity the primal fire and taught them how to use phlogiston, tells the human Cha'ak about another continent aside from Teyvat. The exact paragraph reads, Cha'ak had no idea why they should go yet higher, and didn't want to leave Natlan, but whenever he went to ask Waxaklahun Ubah Kan this question, the latter would only speak of the Lunar Continent and the Niwak Holy Stone and other stuff he couldn't understand. Suppose that before Thanes, the Light Realm was composed of 2 different coexisting worlds. One inhabited by solar dragons, ruled by the 7 sovereigns and symbolized by the sun. Another is inhabited by lunar dragons, ruled by the 3 Moon Sisters and symbolized by the moon. Someone like Morax, for example, who is light-aligned and is filled with draconic motifs, would have lived in the land of the sovereigns, while Hagentis, if she is old enough, would have originated from the Lunar Continent. Together, these 2 concepts form a solar eclipse, and the ring of that eclipse is what I suspect to have been the symbol of the Light Realm's supreme deity, the Logos or logic of the world, Nibelung. I've talked about this way too many times before in the past, but it's quite important for anyone new, so I'm gonna try to keep it short and simple. In Greek mythology, Phanes is described as a god of creation who was born from the cosmic egg of the primordial deities Kronos and Ananke, representing time and fate respectively. In Orphic traditions, Ananke was seen as the mother of the three fates. Therefore, if we are to say that Genshin's Kronos is Nibelung, then it kinda makes sense that his wife would be the mother or queen of the three moon sisters. Anyway, let's say that two dragons, or dinosaurs I suppose, those being Nibelung and whoever Ananke is supposed to be in Genshin, laid an egg. And inside that egg was an angel, or a chicken, whichever analogy suits you best. This chicken would then be Phanes, the firstborn of chickens. Interestingly, in Orphic mythology, Phanes was known as protogonos, an ancient Greek term that translates to firstborn. In light of all of this, I find it really suspicious that Hoyoverse gave us this little guy for Genshin's 4th anniversary, the firstborn fire sprite, and his description reads, "A tiny life form that emerged from a flame within a shell. There is something quite endearing about its over-reliance on the shell it found protecting it at the moment it gained sentience. Perhaps it feels secure in this closed-up world. After all, when its eggshell is completely enclosed, it reigns supreme in its own little universe." No way. I do not even want to humor this idea. I am speechless. At this point, it seems like the Primordial One did not simply invade and conquer the ancient dragons, but rather found a way to convince the Moon Sisters and their lunar dragons to turn on Nibelung and the Seven Sovereigns, essentially kickstarting a civil war within the Light Realm from which it emerged victorious. This explains why the Crimson Moon dynasty laments the fact that fate, which in this case might refer to either Ananke or the Moon Sisters, surrendered themselves to the tyrannical usurper. Their words hint at some kind of treason or rebellion against the original natural order of the world. And this is where Plato's Demiurge comes into play. Just like with the theory of forms, Phanes likely integrated the land of the Moon Sisters into the elemental world of the Sovereigns, forming the human realm and its ley lines, crafting the material world out of perfect concepts. And to borrow a bit from classical Greek mythology, those who sided with Phanes were rewarded with dominion over the new mortal world as gods, envoys, and the like, while Nibelung and his allies got crushed and erased from history. What's nice about this theory is that it aligns with a number of phenomena which we can observe on Teyvat, like why the ley lines have such a strong influence on the environment and the ecosystems where they operate. Imagine the ley lines to be what Plato calls the world of forms, the true reality where human souls originate from. The world of matter would then be molded in the likeness of the ley lines, turning their concepts or forms into something tangible. Knowing that when you alter the ley lines, you are really altering the memories and concepts of how those perfect forms are shaped. And if the concept changes, then the material world it is impressed upon will change with it. This exact idea I just laid out might unironically turn out to be Il Capitano's plan. Boer tells the traveler that the Gnosis allow their wielder to control the ley lines and harness immense elemental power. Before their battle, Il Capitano told Mahuika that he knew the secret of the ley lines, and if the ley lines shape the material world while the Gnosis influence them, then I wonder if Il Capitano's goal is to reconstruct the ley lines themselves, thereby saving the land of Natlan from the abyssal catastrophe. Regardless, this notion that all fundamental forms are inherently good left Plato with a major dilemma, as he still had to reconcile where evil comes from. The solution that Plato and his disciples postulated involved evil as the lack of knowledge or ignorance of the good. Such a definition makes a lot of sense from their perspective, because remember, I'm gonna say it again, neither Plato nor the society he lived in were dualists. Therefore, they needed to absolve their Demiurge prototype of any wrongdoings or faults in its intentions without creating a direct opposite evil entity acting against the Demiurge. Thus, they established the idea of evil and described it as the absence of good or an error in the pursuit of the good. In this framework, the idea of evil would not exist in the same way the forms do, because evil is not a perfect form. but rather a departure from or corruption of what is good. It wasn't until much later in medieval Alexandria, when Gnosticism adopted Plato's concepts, that the idea of evil became its own separate entity, while the Demiurge no longer remained a purely well-intentioned craftsman trying to create the optimal world for humans out of chaos. If you ask me, I doubt that the developers will strictly adhere to these Platonic and Gnostic ideas, because putting their own creative liberties aside, Genshin is also significantly inspired by other sources such as Chinese mythology, Buddhism, traditional Christianity, and Norse mythology. Nonetheless, the core message should remain intact. Okay, now that we are almost done, I think we should talk about snakes. Snakes are cool. In Orphic traditions, Phanes' symbol is the serpent, not because he himself is one, but due to the fact that both of his parents are also symbolized by serpents. Also, Phanes himself is depicted with a serpent wrapped around him, reaching to the Orphic egg on his crown. I won't go into all the serpent imagery in Genshin since that would take forever. Long story short, after learning about the ancient dragon civilization and their technology, in addition to the architectural and technological similarities they share with the primordial one's first civilization, I have a feeling that the Kingdom of Heaven, which Barbatos talks about in the Battle Pass, is actually supposed to be Nibelung's kingdom in the Light Realm. In that story, the King of Heaven sends his second-born heir to retrieve the pearl that was stolen from him by a black serpent. So, I wonder if the story of the Pale Princess and the Six Pygmies takes place on the Lunar Continent rather than on Teyvat. After all, Khaenri'ah isn't exactly part of what we conventionally understand as Teyvat, and the nation has ties to both serpents and Seelies alike. Furthermore, this kingdom, being wedged in between Teyvat and the Land of Night, aligns with the kingdom of the Pygmies, which is said to have been part of the Night Mother's realm. Earlier in the video, I said that wherever light shines, it casts a shadow. In the Moonlight Forest being the shadow cast by Nibelung's kingdom, this buffer zone between the Light Realm and the Abyss matches up with what Waxaklahun Ubah Kan said about the Lunar Continent. After all, the occasional rays of moonlight were the only source of hope in the Land of Night, something that ever irritated the Night Mother, for she could not tolerate their existence. In the end, the Six Pygmies, who now we know are Dainsleif, Vedderfolnir, Rerir, Surtalogi, Rheindotter, and Hroptatyr, succumbed to their desires and murdered the Prince of Light, while the Night Mother sealed away the Pale Princess in an eternal slumber. At any rate, that's more than enough insanity for a single video. I was honestly going to talk more about the Pale Princess and the Six Pygmies, but I'm gonna save that for another video because I am running out of time and I also have a shit ton of real life work to attend to. As always, huge thanks to all Patreon supporters, and thank you for watching till the end. For now, I've been My Name for Now, and I will catch you in the next one. Take care.